Hello, welcome back to the Transformations of the Global System. I am Dr. Nicole Warrington Granston, and today we'll be looking at human rights and human security. Now, this presentation will explore human rights, human security, humanitarian intervention, and the tensions between universal rights and state sovereignty. As such, we'll explain how global politics increasingly focuses not only on protecting states, but also protecting individuals from violence, poverty, discrimination, and security. So let's start off by defining human rights. What are human rights? Human rights are basic rights and freedoms that belong to all people simply because they are human. The main principles are that they are universal, inherent, indivisible, and inalienable. What we know is that human rights apply regardless of nationality, race, religion, gender, or political system. So what we think about human rights is that it's meant to protect human dignity globally. Now, the origins of human rights, what are some of the historical developments of it? Is that the concept actually developed through Enlightenment ideas, natural rights philosophy, democratic revolutions, and even reactions to war and oppression. Some of the major historical influences include liberal political thought, anti-slavery movements, and World War II and the Holocaust. So let's talk about the development of what we would know as the human rights regime. Now, the United Nations actually adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. The purpose was to establish global standards for human rights protection. These rights included right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, equality before the law, right to education, and right to work. So what we find is that the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights was really the foundation of modern human rights laws. So what are said to be the main categories of human rights? So the first category that we know is that of the first generation rights, which look at civil and political rights. These are the ones that protect individual freedoms. These would include freedom of expression, voting rights, freedom from torture, and fair trial rights. The second generation human rights are what covers the economic, social, and cultural rights. So they basically protect social well-being. Examples of this would be healthcare, education, housing, and employment. Then we have the third generation human rights that focuses on collective or solidarity rights. These are rights that are held by groups or people. These would be the right to development, environmental rights, and self-determination. Now let's move on to the next concept of human security. So human security focuses on protecting individuals rather than only states. So when we think about traditional security versus human security, we know that traditional security is all about protecting the state. It looks at military threats and it focuses on borders and sovereignty. While human security protects individuals, focuses on broad human threats, and it kind of focuses also on human welfare and dignity. The main idea is that security includes freedom from fear, violence, hunger, and poverty. So we find that we've seen a shift in global politics away from the focus on state-centered security to people-centered security. So what are some of the threats to human security? There are actually multiple threats. These would include war and conflict, terrorism, poverty, disease, climate change, human trafficking, and political repression. So we find that many modern threats actually cross borders and really require international cooperation. So let's talk about it. As we had mentioned about this development of a human rights regime, there is this big debate between sovereignty and human rights, where the argument is, should states be free from outside intervention when it comes to their human rights abuses, or What about the idea that states have control of their internal affairs and they should do so without any external intervention? But then on the other side, we talk about the idea of humanitarian concerns, where human rights advocates would argue that the international community should act when genocide, ethnic cleansing, and mass atrocities occur. So we see that when we're looking at international politics, that there's this tension between sovereignty and humanitarian intervention. Now, do we define humanitarian intervention? Now, it's basically the use of force or international action to stop serious human rights abuses. The goals are to protect civilians, prevent atrocities, and to stop genocide. Now, this brings us back to this concept that was developed known as responsibility to protect, or R2P. And the main idea behind this is that if a state fails to protect its population, the international community has the responsibility to act. There's actually three responsibilities: to prevent, to react, and to rebuild. So we know that R2P change debates about intervention when we're seeing atrocities occurring. So, what are some of the main criticisms of humanitarian intervention? The common critiques are: one, the violation of sovereignty, because intervention may undermine state independence. The second is that of selected intervention, where we find that powerful states will intervene inconsistently. When you think about places like Somalia and earlier the genocide in Rwanda, because states or powerful states did not want to use the word genocide, you saw that the United Nations, through the Security Council, intervened too late after a lot of murder happened on both sides within Rwanda. Right? So we find that some crises may receive attention while others sometimes tend to be ignored. Then there's said to be sometimes what we call hidden political motives. We find that critics argue interventions may hide economic interests, strategic goals, or even geopolitical ambitions. Now, there's also this discussion between universalism and cultural relativism, right? The universal view is that human rights apply equally everywhere. However, there's a cultural relativist view where they argue that human rights should reflect cultural and historical differences. So the main debate tends to be, can universal standards exist across all societies? So we know that there are tensions between Western liberal values and cultural traditions. Now let's look at women's human rights. Now, women's rights became increasingly important in global politics. Some of the key issues have been gender discrimination, violence against women, unequal political participation, and reproductive rights. When we look at the feminist perspectives on this issue, is that we find that feminists argue traditional human rights approaches often ignored women's experiences. The important themes that come up in the argument are that of the patriarchy, gender inequality, and structural discrimination. So we kind of look at, or what the feminists brought to the discussion, is how gender shapes access to rights and security. So let's now talk about human rights enforcement. Now, the key international mechanisms that we have are the institutions I'm going to be listing now. That of the United Nations, the International Criminal Court is a second one. Then there are also human rights treaties and even regional courts that help to enforce human rights. We also have the NGOs and advocacy groups. Basically, examples of these groups would be Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And their roles tend to be focusing on monitoring abuses, raising awareness, and pressuring governments. Now, what would be said to be the challenges to human rights protections? The main challenges are that of weak enforcement, state resistance, political interest, lack of international consensus, and ongoing conflict. So we find that human rights protection often depends on political will. By extension, we see where globalization has played a role both positively and negatively on human rights. Some of the positive effects is that we've seen how globalization spreads information, activism, and awareness. The negative effects have been that it's actually deepened inequality, increased exploitation, and weakened local protections. So we're seeing that both opportunities and risk have been created by globalization in the spread of human rights. So, with that, the main takeaways are as follows. Human rights aim to protect human dignity universally. Human security expands sovereignty beyond military threats. And we know that tensions remain between sovereignty, culture, and international intervention. Some important terms I want you guys to remember are those of human rights, human security, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, sovereignty, humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect, or R2P, universalism, cultural relativism, civil rights, and economic and social rights. With that, I will close by saying that human rights and human security reflect the growing belief that global politics should protect not only states, but also the dignity, freedom, and safety of individuals. Thank you.